Welcome to this Orchid Spotlight on configuring an extender manual workflow. My name's Anne from Orchid Systems. In this video, we're going to run through what is a manual workflow, what software is required for manual workflows. We're going to set up an example workflow template on putting the customer on hold, and we're going to test this workflow template. Manual workflows are ones that are started by the user on a screen, and the workflow template has the Can Start Manually set to Yes. Whereas automatic workflows are started automatically by Extender. They can be attached to view fields. For example, when the customer's credit limit changes, automatically start the workflow, or they can be attached to view inserts, updates, and/or deletes. For example, when an order is inserted, start this workflow. They can also be started by your own custom processes or by Process Scheduler Level 1. For manual workflows, you need Extender, either the Configurator, Customizer, or Developer Edition. Depending on the complexity of your workflow, if you only need the standard actions that come out of the box, then you can use the Configurator Edition. If you need your own custom actions, then you would need the Customizer Edition. And if you need tables to support the logic of your custom actions, then you would need the Developer Edition. But Manual for Workflows gets started from a Sage 300 screen. And in order to configure that, you need Orchid users. So the Orchid users are needed to make the workflow icons available on the required screens, and for you to progress the workflow icons from the configured screens, or to use the workflow console screen to progress the workflow. The requirements for the Customer on Hold manual workflow are as follows. On the AR Customer Inquiry screen, we want to be able to start a workflow if we notice the customer's balance is overdue or they're over their credit terms. So we want to start the manual workflow, which is going to put the customer on hold. And then, if approved by two separate users, then the customer can be taken off hold. Signed into Sage 300 as Dan, and using the AR Customer Inquiry to look at customer 1500, on the credit status, we notice that they're way over their credit limit, and this customer is not on hold. And because Dan has been configured as an Orchid user, and a manual workflow has been configured around the AR Customer Inquiry, Dan can put the customer on hold, or start the workflow to put the customer on hold. And this workflow prompts for a parameter, a reason why do you want to put them on hold. And after entering that parameter, the workflow is started. Because Dan is allowed to see all entries in the workflow, Dan will see the Customer on Hold manual workflow has been started by himself at this time, and it's assigned to Natalie to recommend to take it off hold if she wants. And refreshing the AR Customer Inquiry for 1500, you can see the customer has been put on hold. And from here, the green triangle tells us that the workflow is in progress for 1500, and the next step is to recommend to take it off hold or reject the recommendation to take it off hold. And we can see the log of what has happened so far. Again, the same entry as what we saw on the console. And the values have been set. Approver 1 is Natalie, and Approver 2 is Steve. As Approver 1, Natalie would have received this email saying the customer custom comfort has been put on hold with the reason that Dan typed in and the date and time that was happened. And as logged in as Natalie, looking at the workflow console, if I select only those assigned to me or a group I'm in, Natalie can see that this workflow instance is assigned to her, and the options she has is to recommend to take this off hold, in which case Steve gets an email to take this customer off hold if he wants to, or reject the off hold, in which case it gets left on hold and Dan will get an email accordingly. So if Natalie wanted to see the transactions and the credit status of the customer, from the workflow console, we could drill into the customer activity or the customer screen. And here we could review the customer credit status or the transactions outstanding. And we can see also from here, we could progress the workflow to either recommend to take it off hold or reject the off hold recommendation. But Natalie's going to recommend to take this off hold, which is going to progress the workflow, and it's now no longer assigned to Natalie. But if we view all, because Natalie has security clearance to view all, she can see that this has now been assigned to Steve. And Steve has received an email saying that 1500 has been put on hold, Dan's reason, but Natalie has reviewed this and recommends that we take it off hold. And now signed in as Steve, I can go to the workflow console and viewing those workflow instances that are assigned to me, I can see that this is the on hold recommendation to take the customer off hold. I can drill down to the customer activity or the customer. I can see the values, the on hold reason, and the approver 1 and approver 2. But I can also see the history of what's happened on this workflow instance. So first, the customer was put on hold by Dan, and it was waiting for Natalie to approve. And then Natalie approved the first step of approval, and that's when it got assigned to me. So if I go ahead and approve this off-hold request, the workflow is marked complete. I know that because there's no next step. And if I had configured this workflow accordingly, it would have been deleted off the console. If we look at the history, we see that Dan put it on hold. The first level of recommendation to take off hold was done by Natalie, and then it was taken off hold by Steve. And if we drill down to the customer or the customer activity, we see that the customer has now been taken off hold. And Dan and Natalie have been sent an email saying the customer was originally put off hold and now has been taken off hold by Steve on this date and time. So we've seen a very quick demonstration of this workflow template where Dan on the AR inquiry screen put the customer on hold, and then Natalie recommended that we take the customer off hold, and Steve confirmed and took the customer off hold. To see the configuration that was required for this workflow, we'll first look at the email setup in Extender options, look at our email message templates, look at our workflow colors, our workflow templates, and then how we configured the tray icon to show the workflow icons on the AR customer inquiry. For the customer on hold workflow, first we need to configure the email setup in Extender options so the workflow is able to send emails. We need to configure our email message templates. So this is the email template when Dan first put the customer on hold. And this is the email template that was used when Natalie recommended that we take the customer off hold. And using F1 allows you to see all the different message variables that you can use. And the last email template was when Steve recommended that the customer gets taken off hold. We did have the console entries going from green to grey and orange. And then we have our workflow templates. Workflow templates consist of steps that are going to be actioned, and then within a step, the individual actions that belong to that step. You've got progress to steps, and you've got workflow values. It is much easier to create yourself a workflow template if you have a flowchart showing you what the workflow is to do. with all the steps and actions highlighted. Accordingly, we have a flowchart for our AR customer set on hold manual workflow template. First, Dan reviewed the AR customer record in the AR inquiry screen and decided to put the customer on hold. And that's when our entry step, set on hold, was triggered. Dan entered a reason, the customer was set on hold, and an email was sent to Natalie. And that's when the workflow was in the state of waiting for first approval. And Natalie saw the steps either to recommend off hold or reject off hold. And once Natalie recommended off hold, that's when we saw the workflow instance waiting for Steve in the second approval stage. And Steve could approve the off hold or reject the off hold. And when Steve approved the off hold request, the customer was set off hold and an email was sent back to Dan and Natalie saying that the customer had been taken off hold and the workflow was completed. This is the very high level, major steps of our workflow. And this translates to the steps of the workflow. So we have the set on hold step, the wait for first approval step, the reject off hold step, the wait for second approval, the recommend off hold as part of the first approval, the approve off hold, the reject off hold as part of the second approval, and a step for error handling. So our customer on hold manual workflow is active. We set it not to auto-delete when complete, and that is why the record remained on the console. Typically, you do this while you're testing the workflow and while you want to see it on the console, but otherwise you would say yes, auto-delete when complete. And can start manually is set to yes. When you have a manual workflow, you can get Extender to check whether you allow multiple instances of that workflow running for the same record. So could I have 2 on-hold requests for customer 1500 at the same point in time? So we've set it to no. So if we try to set it on hold again, or a second user tried to set it on hold, they would get an error message. So the entry step is set on hold. And this step consists of all these actions, which we'll go through shortly. But the major steps on our workflow template was to set it on hold, wait for first approval, and wait for first approval had the actions either recommend off hold or reject off hold. And here's our recommend off hold step and our reject off hold step. And the recommend off hold step moves on to the wait for second approval, which can either approve off hold or reject off hold, which are these steps here, and some overall error handling. Accordingly, we have a workflow step corresponding to each of the main steps on our flowchart. And then per step, you need to have a flowchart to say what individual actions do you want to do as part of that step. For our entry step set on hold, we've got this following flowchart. We're going to set some workflow variables to set the value, set the drill down, and set the description on the console. We're going to store the parameters. We're going to prompt the user for the reason. Why do you want to put the customer on hold? Put the customer on hold. Send an email to the approver 1. Assign the workflow to approver 1 and set the workflow status. And then go to step wait for first approval. And these orange boxes indicate the individual actions. So the individual actions within the set on hold step, having a look at detail at the actions for the set on hold step and using the F9 zoom to look at the actions one by one, the first action sets the value of the special field view ID to AR0024. You need this because for manual workflows, there is no inherent associated view ID. And if successful and if false, both go to action 20. And the action for step 20 sets the drill down into the customer field. So we're saying that the field that we're drilling down into is customer and the value is the ID cust. And this is from the view AR0024. The next step is to set the description for the workflow console. And we're setting it to the name of the customer and the hard text put on hold. And then we're setting two workflow variables, approver 1 and approver 2, based on the parameters that were passed into the set on hold step. Parameter 1 is the salesperson, which is approver 1, and parameter 2 is the manager, which is approver 2. And then we're adding a parameter to the workflow. We're calling the parameter hold reason, giving it a label, giving it a text size 60, and putting the default value in customer put on hold. And then we prompt the user for the parameter. And then we're setting a field SW hold, which is the on hold flag on the customer. We're setting it to 1, which is on true. And then sending an email to the approver 1 using the value of our variable. So in our case, it's going to be Natalie. And we're CCing ST user, which is the user who started the workflow, and approver 2, which is in our case Steve. And the subject includes the ID of the customer. Then we're assigning approver 1, which is Natalie, to the workflow, and assigning the color yellow to the workflow console. And we're setting the status for the workflow console to say on hold, waiting for approval, and going to step wait for first approval. We also have a go to step showing an error message. If any of the workflow actions give an error, then we're going to go to step 140 and then show the error message. So in this particular step, if we try and set the customer on hold and we cannot do that, then it's going to go to the step error message. And a situation where we could not be able to set the customer on hold is if the person who starts the workflow doesn't have edit rights to AR customers. And the actions for the error message is to send an email to admin saying what error has happened, which workflow template we were in, and set a error status on hold onto the workflow console and assign the color urgent, which is a red color. So it's obvious there's something wrong with that record on the console, and assign the user to admin. And having a look at all the actions which are part of the wait for first approval step, we can see that the wait for first approval has two progress to steps, recommend off hold or reject off hold. The recommend off hold step needs to set the status of the workflow, set the value, who did the approving of the first approval, send an email to the second approver, and assign the workflow instance to the second approver, and set the color of the console to green. But if the workflow instance reject off hold is clicked, then it's going to set the status to rejected, send an email to the starter, and assign the console color gray. And we can see how these yellow boxes translate into actions within the step for the recommend off hold and the reject off hold. And having a look at that in the software itself, the wait for first approval step has no associated actions, but only a progress to step, the recommend off hold and reject off hold. And these are the two buttons that we see on the workflow console when the workflow instance is on this step. Or we also see these two buttons on the workflow icon on the AR customer inquiry. If recommend off hold is clicked, then these are the actions. First, we're going to set the workflow status so we can see that in the console to approval 1 off hold. We're going to set the value of who did the approving so that when approver 2 approves, we can check that it doesn't equal approver 1. We're going to send an email to approver 2 and CC the user, the starter. And we're going to assign the workflow instance to approver 2, assign the color to orange so it shows on the console as orange, and go to the step wait for second approval. If the reject on hold was clicked, then it's going to set the status to rejected, customer remains on hold. It's going to send an email to the starter, CC approver 1 and approver 2. It's going to assign the color rejected, which is a gray color, and complete the workflow. And the actions for wait for second approval are as follows. Wait for second approval has 2 progress to steps, approve off hold or reject off hold. And within approve off hold, the steps are to first check if the user who's approving the off hold equals the user who did the first level approval. If that's true, then show an error message and go back to wait for second approval. But if the users are different, then it's going to record who the second approver was, take the custom off hold, and send an email to the starter, set the workflow status and color, and complete the workflow instance. If the reject off hold is clicked, it's going to set the status of the workflow instance, send an email back to the starter telling them that it's been rejected off hold, assign the color to rejected, and complete the workflow instance. And having a look at that in the software, the wait for second approval has the approve off hold and reject off hold buttons, no actions associated with it. If they click approve off hold, the first thing it's going to do is evaluate if the user that is currently clicking the button is not equal to approver 1, then it's going to the true action, which is step 20. If it's is equal to the approver 1, then it's going to the false action, which is step 80. Step 20, this is where the users are different. It's going to set the workflow value to approver 2. It's going to set the field on the AR customer, the on hold field to 0, which is off hold. And if there's an error, it's going to step 100, which is the error message step. It's going to send an email to the starter, CC the approver 1, saying that the customer has been taken off hold. It's going to set the status of the workflow to off hold complete, assign the color to approved, which is a green color, and complete the workflow. If the logged on user who's doing the second level approval is equal to the same user who did the first level approval, then we're going to show the user the error message saying that the second approver must be different to the first approver, and it's going back to the step to wait for the second approval. And if they click reject off hold, it's the same steps for the first level approval for the rejecting of the off hold request. And the final piece of configuration you need to do is in Information Manager Options on the Notes.dml workflow tray configuration. You need to configure your workflow icons for the AR customer inquiry screen. So best thing to do for this is to open up your AR customer inquiry screen and then open up your tray options and lay it beside your AR customer inquiry screen. And when you activate that screen, you will see that its roto ID is AR1700 and the field you're triggering off is customer no full stop. And then you configure that in IM options for the roto ID and the customer number field, and you say that is to start an extender workflow, and the extender workflow template ID is customer on hold manual workflow, and the entry step to start is set on hold, And parameter 1 is going to be the salesperson, Natalie. Parameter 2 is the manager, Steve. If I open up the AR customer inquiry, and this is the screen that I want to configure the workflow icon around, I right-hand mouse button on my tray icon and select options and put the screen beside my AR customer inquiry screen. When I activate the screen and field, I can see the field is customer no, full stop, and the roto ID is AR1700. Accordingly, in my IM options, I configure a row for roto ID AR1700. I say it's an extender workflow that this particular icon is going to trigger on AR1700 field label customer no full stop. And the workflow it's going to start is the custom on hold manual workflow, and the entry step it's going to run is set on hold. And parameter 1 is the salesperson, Natalie. Parameter 2 is the manager, Steve. Now that we've seen the setup of the workflow template, let's test again. So again, logged in as Dan on the AR customer inquiry screen, I see the workflow icon. And from here, I'm able to start the workflow on any customer record as long as I am flagged as an Orchid user, and because we've got the configuration for the tray icon to start the workflow icon on the AR customer inquiry screen. So because customer has exceeded his credit limit and the customer is currently not on hold, we're going to go ahead and start the manual workflow. And because of the ask parameters in the workflow, it's asking for a on-hold reason. And when we go OK, the workflow instance is started and the email is sent to Natalie, and we can see that the workflow instance is the color yellow. And refreshing the customer record, we see it is now on hold. The workflow icon has now gone green, indicating that a workflow is active for this particular record for 1200. And I can see what the next steps are. I can also drill into the log if I want to. I cannot start another on-hold workflow for this particular customer, as my template said that I was not able to have multiple instances running for the same record. And Natalie receives the email saying that 1200 Mr. Ronald Black has been put on hold, and the reason is he has exceeded the credit limit, and the workflow is started by Dan. Now logged in as Natalie, we can go to the workflow console, and if we look at only those instances assigned to me, you can see it's assigned to Natalie. It is showing our workflow instance in yellow, and the workflow status is on hold, waiting for approval. And Natalie sees the two options available from this step. She can either recommend off hold or reject off hold. She can drill down to the customer activity or the AR customer, look at the history. At this stage, there's only the one record in the history, and look at the values. If Natalie decides to recommend off hold and clicks this button, or goes to the AR customer activity screen and chooses to progress the workflow from here, the reason Natalie is seeing this single person as the tray icon is because there's a workflow active for this particular customer and it is assigned to Natalie. If it was assigned to a group that Natalie was in, then she would see 3 people here. But Natalie's going to recommend off hold, which is going to update the workflow instance and assign it to Steve. Because Natalie can view all instances, we can click this and we can now see the workflow is, the color is orange, It was started by Dan, but it's now assigned to Steve. The step it's on is wait for second approval, and the workflow status is approval 1, okay to take off hold. And Steve has received this email saying that Dan put the customer on hold, but it's been reviewed by Natalie, and after a conversation with Mr. Ronald Black, has recommended that we take the customer off hold. Administrator has heard, however, that Steve is out of the office for a few days, and so has decided to reassign all his tasks that are waiting for him. Administrator has the ability to view all and amend all workflows, and is going to take this particular workflow instance and reassign it to either to a user group or to a user. And he's going to assign it to Natalie. So the workflow is now assigned to Natalie. On Natalie's console, she now sees that she's assigned this task, the wait for second approval, and can go ahead and look at the history, drill down or look at the values, and they can see that Dan submitted it, Natalie approved for the first approval, and then it's been reassigned from Steve to Natalie. And if she says, yes, we're going to take this off hold, so approve the off hold request, Natalie gets an error message saying a second approver is required different from the first approver. So it's going to go back into the wait state. So we need to reassign this to somebody other than Natalie. So let's reassign to Steve again. So Steve sees the workflow instance that he needs to approve, and looking at the history, he can see that Dan submitted it in the step set on hold. Natalie, for the wait step for the first approver approved, and it got assigned to Steve. And then admin reassigned it to Natalie. Natalie tried to approve, but got the error message and then had to reassign back to Steve. And now Steve can go ahead and either reject the off-hold request or approve the off-hold request. Assuming he approves the off-hold request, the workflow is updated to the green color, and the status is made off-hold on complete, and the relevant emails have been sent. Now, had this workflow been made auto-delete on complete, this row would be deleted, as there is nothing more in the console for Steve to do. And in that case, any inquiries, you would need to go to the workflow summary log. And here you see one row per workflow instance, but looking down at the detail of that, you'll see all the individual steps that happened. We have seen the setup steps we needed to do to run a workflow. We needed to create the users, the user groups if we're using them, workflow colors if we're using them, and the email message templates. And then we need to create our workflow template. We need to create our steps, create variables, create the actions for the steps, and create the progress to steps where appropriate. And then we need to link a manual workflow to the appropriate screens so that the workflow can be started. And we went to IM options, notes and DML extender tray, and configured a icon for the running of the manual workflow. Then we saw how to start the workflow off the AR customer inquiry. We saw how to progress the workflow either on the AR customer inquiry or on the workflow console. And we saw the workflow inquiries, how you can drill into the underlying screen, how you can drill into the values and go to the workflow inquiry screen to look at the workflow summary log and workflow detail log. Thank you for your time. For more information on Extender and other Orchid products, please go to www.orchid.systems.